And I'm pretty fortunate that I get to share information about those things that I love in the natural world in many different places. Tonight I'm going to talk with you about frogs, about fascinating frogs. There are many, many, many different things that are out there that I consider fascinating. As a naturalist, I have a hard time staying focused on one thing at a time. It's kind of how I got into this line of work. My formal training is I'm a plant physiologist. And, you know, if you're interested in talking about phloem and xylem and water potential and all those physiological things within plants, I'd be glad to talk with you about that, maybe after the talk. But what I found was as I was out doing the research throughout the Southeast, was that there were so many things. I would go to collect plants to do the identification and whatever study we have to be doing, and there are always things crawling on them. So this was, to begin with, it was like you were cleaning the garbage, so to speak, out of your samples. And then you'd start to notice that, well, on this plant, there was this small insect that was there. And you'd pile them up on there, and we'd have a lot of aquatic samples back there, and all of a sudden you'd see the whole thing start shifting and moving around. And the question was, okay, what's moving? Well, as you guessed it, there were things that were feeding upon the insects that were there, small fishes, frogs, and occasionally a snake or two that might have gotten collected, little small ones, and you didn't necessarily know you had those in your collection when they came up. So over time, beginning to look at all of these connections is what really caught my interest, and I decided that probably being a plant physiologist was not my calling in life. It was being a naturalist. It was looking at the connections between the different organisms that were out there, but also how they interacted with their environment. And frogs, as well as toads, we'll talk a little about the difference between the two tonight, are very, very interactive with the environment around them and are greatly affected by the environment around them. Some have referred to them as the canary in the coal mine. Because they're so sensitive to changes within their surroundings, any changes within them can be detected as an indicator many times of what's happening within the natural world around them. Okay? Windows could not activate. Okay. Oh, I activated. We did it. You just take a deep breath and all of a sudden things will pop up. And then you just never know what's going to come up there. With frogs are one of those things in which we know that are out there, but it's many times are one of the organisms that we overlook many times because they are masters of camouflage. They're going to be hidden so well that many times you don't see them. But many times without seeing them, you'll know they're there because you'll hear them. Now there's going to be a quiz in a moment. All right. How many different species of frogs and toads did you hear?
That 40 played it.
How many of you think there was more than one species within that? Absolutely. And many times when you're out doing frog watches, trying to get an idea of what types of frogs are within that area, that'll end up happening. And you're trying to decide how many individuals that was. Basically, we just refer to that as a chorus of frogs, if you would. There are multiple frogs calling at one time. Sometimes you can pick them out and it's just a single call. You'll hear the peeper go beep, beep, beep. And then you may hear a chorus frog over here doing this little call. But that is definitely a chorus of frogs. Great, great numbers. And when I hear that sound, it's sort of a harbinger of spring to me. When I start hearing the frog calls in early December, sometimes late December, depending upon where I am in the state, I start thinking about spring and I start getting excited because I know that those long winter days, if you will, are starting to come to an end. And I'm always looking forward to that. But it also makes me think back, like hopefully many of you, makes you think back to your childhood. Reminds you of those days when you're down by the pond, catching frogs, put them in a jar, taking a close look at them, starting to learn a bit about what they were about. Also, hopefully learning very quickly that you need to put holes in the lid of the jar. You learn, if nothing else, pretty quickly that they need a little bit of air. Hopefully you discovered that, as they start to look a little bit uncomfortable and you begin to unscrew the jar and you look down inside and all of a sudden they get a breath of air, no pun intended, and they sort of jump up at you, if you would. Yes, I have experienced that on a few occasions. Okay. But also as you begin to look down into the ponds and the lakes and the edges of the rivers, you begin to notice these small masses of little movements of organisms like I have here on the table. And we'll get a chance to look at these in just a little while after the program. Begin to see all these tadpoles. These are wood frog tadpole eggs, and these are our first tadpole eggs to come out. Why? Because they are our earliest, when I say us, the Blue Ridge, the Southern Appalachians, and then the Inner Piedmont. Those are the earliest of our breeding population, so they're the first tadpoles to come out. If you look out and you see a gigantic tadpole at the size of your thumb, that didn't hatch out this spring. That's a bullfrog from last year. Yeah, they'll hatch out. They will then overwinter in many cases and come out. So you see these big bullfrogs, and those are ones that were kind of the end of the season last year. Okay? But of course you see those and you want to catch those as well. Yeah. And you get yourself some tadpoles and you put them in a jar. And as a young lady who was in here earlier, she was in the 4th grade and she was telling me all about frogs, and she's learning in school about frogs. And she looked in there and she said, "What's that stuff in the bottom of this little tank?" And I began to sort of in a nice way explain that when frogs eat, just like everything else, what goes in must come out. All right? And as that happens, you all of a sudden find out that your sample, while it might have been green to begin with, begins to green up a little bit as a little fertilizer is added in there. But just watching those little eggs hatch out, the little tadpoles come out, and then of course as they continue to develop, they get those back legs, and then they start to grow those front legs. And then when the time is right, the tail falls off. The scientific name for toads and frogs are the anurans. And anuran basically means tailless. They start out with tails, but they lose those by the time they're out of the tadpole stage. Okay? I've been fortunate enough for year-round for almost 20 years, and for part of the year for almost 25 years now, to be within the Blue Ridge Mountains, within South Carolina and North Carolina, and a little bit over into Tennessee. And when you look out at these scenes in the wintertime, in December, usually last of December, early January, you're looking out through the snow, and the last thing in your mind is frogs. But then as you're walking through the forest, you hear almost sounds like a turkey clucking in a way. But just wait, they're just getting started. So you hear these frogs beginning to call. You're not going to find this particular frog down by the river. You're going to have to walk into the woods a little bit. And what you're going to find is you're going to find these areas that we refer to them as intermittent or short-lived ponds. In the Northeast, they refer to them as vernal pools. In other words, it's going to be an area that's going to contain water for only part of the year. The advantage to that is because it dries out, it can't support fish. So why would a wood frog and many other amphibians want to lay their eggs where there are no fish? Well, there's no big predator. Well, there's one less predator, shall we say, the fish that are in there. So they lay these huge masses of eggs that are out there. And as I mentioned earlier to some folks I was talking with, when the wood frogs come in, they come in by the thousands. And what they're going to do is they are going to lay their eggs in huge masses and pile them on top of each other with big layers. And if you look down into the pond and sort of scoop up a handful of them, the ones that are on the right, if you notice, you can make out individual eggs. They almost look kind of like a little grape, if you would, a little clear grape with a seed in the middle. But if you look on this side, you'll notice that the egg mass is surrounded by a larger coating of gel, if you would. All right? These are wood frog eggs. But wood frogs lay their eggs in the same habitat as our state amphibian, the spotted salamander. All right? Spotted salamanders also attach their eggs to a stick or something else to keep it from moving around, whereas the wood frog eggs will just be big masses that are moving around, and they can kind of shift around with water movement just a little bit, but there's really not a whole lot of movement. So why would you lay the eggs this thick? If you look closely on here, you'll notice that there is ice. One of the survival skills, one of the adaptations of wood frogs is that by laying these huge masses of eggs, the ones that are underneath are under this protective blanket of the ones that were laid later. So the ones on the top are sort of the sacrificial eggs. They can get frozen over. They're also exposed to the direct sunlight. And the ones that are underneath are not getting frozen. They're also staying a little bit warmer and they're not in direct sunlight. Several studies have shown that the stronger, if you would, the genetically stronger of the wood frogs lay their eggs first because they're the first to mate. Think of the advantage of that. If you mate first, lay your eggs, then the other eggs get laid on top of your eggs, therefore they're protected underneath that blanket. All right? Another really neat adaptation of these wood frogs is they themselves can freeze. That is a frog sickle. The frog is not dead. One of the things that it will do is, of course, what happens is when a cell freezes in tissue, if that water is going to expand and can sometimes expand to the point that it bursts the cell, which is not good. You don't want your cells bursting in tissue. Not a good thing. So these frogs actually can remove the water to a certain extent from their cells, but they also have sort of a frog antifreeze, if you would. And basically it's something that will not allow, just like antifreeze in your car, won't allow the water to freeze until it gets to a much colder temperature. But they can have the majority of their water outside of the cell to freeze, and then, when the conditions are right, this is what that frog looks like. The wood frog is our only known frog in North America that its range is all the way up into the Arctic. Now, if you can freeze, basically, and when you lay your eggs, if you do so in such a way in which you're not going to have complete loss of your future generations, if you would, eggs, then you can have a much wider range. That's why I mentioned being fortunate enough to be within the Blue Ridge Mountains. You're going to see the range of the wood frog being all the way up into the Arctic. It's going to come down, and then it's going to follow this long finger-like projection, this peninsula, if you will, that we know as the Appalachian Mountains. And the wood frog, like many other species of animals and plants, can survive in these conditions because, well, they're much more similar to what you would find in the Northeast. And so every January, the forest sort of comes alive with the sound of the wood frog. Not turkeys clucking, but wood frogs. Right? There's another frog that comes out around the same time. Depending upon where you are, this frog is widely spread, but it's but about a week, maybe 2 weeks difference. Little tiny frog with a really big voice. And when I say tiny, I mean tiny. That is an adult. Okay? Little frog, big voice.
It's like a bird. Is that the one we refer to as a tree frog?
Sometimes they're referred to as tree frogs. This particular one usually is more known by the common name of a spring peeper because it peeps. What a great name, huh? Peep. Now this is one peeper calling out, but can you imagine in the very beginning there were lots of peepers? So it's very loud. And a lot of times you'll hear these at night when you're driving down the roads because they'll get in the wet ditches along the road shoulders. They don't have to have a big nice pond or lake. They like the ditches just as well. Okay? But that small of an animal, how do you make this big of a call? Well, you can fill your throat pouch, if you would, with large amounts of air. And by that large amount of air is actually going to help amplify that sound. And even better, if you lay that big pouch on the edge of the water a little bit, it makes the water vibrate. Next time you hear frogs, go look near the edge of the water. You may not see them, but you'll see the water just sort of shimmying a little bit. So it's not just the sound of the male frog calling. He's hoping to maybe excite and attract the female by exciting the water a little bit, if you would. Get a little vibration going on in there. Another old friend you probably know. Now, this is one that sometimes is a little bit difficult to identify because there are two that look very similar, and I will show you the difference between the two. But when you hear this one call, you'll know what it is right away. It's just getting started. Get a little bass in there. Got some other ones joining in. Well, if you look at the physics of sound, lower sounds like bass are going to carry, and they have a longer wavelength to them. So as that high pitch, that peep, it's just kind of over like beep, beep. But that deep bass of the bullfrog is going to cause more vibration within the water, but also the air as well, which is going to make it sound even bigger. That's one of the things that the science shows, is that the males that have the strongest calls are those that are usually the most successful in carrying on the species, passing their genetic material on. Okay? Interestingly enough, though, there's a lot of research that shows if you happen to be a male bullfrog, or many other species of bullfrog, or any other frog, if your voice is a little puny, you just stay nearby one that has a really deep voice. That's all I'm going to say on that one, okay? All right? Now, they can actually, this is once again a bullfrog again, but the coloration is going to be a little bit different on there. But notice the size of this. It's called a tympana. It's the scientific word for the ear, if you would, for a frog. Okay. So they need to be able to pick up on those sounds that are out there. So they have these large tympana on the sides of their head. Versus this one, which has a little bit smaller tympana on the side of the head. And there's also a couple of other things. There's has to do with a crest in the middle of the head, some other things. But this one is quite appropriately named for this one because it has a lot of the color green in it. Not all of them do, but this is the green frog. Doesn't have that same deep bass.
Tim, what's the life expectancy of frogs? Is it just a year?
A lot of frogs don't make it a year.
They don't. Okay, because they get eaten?
They get eaten. They get ran over on rainy nights.
Yeah. So it's a year.
Yeah.
Okay.
They have a pretty short life expectancy, most of them. Now, frogs can live a little bit longer out of captivity, but it's a short life expectancy. And that's one of the things that you'll find not only with frogs and toads, you'll find among other organisms, if you have short life expectancy, you produce a lot. Okay? Right? Oh. That's a beautiful frog, isn't it? A handsome frog, if you would. This is the pickerel frog, northern pickerel frog. It can sometimes be confused with the leopard frog because they do look very similar. But if you'll notice in here that these spots on the back are more squared off, leopard frog patches are going to be more rounded. And usually on the pickerel frog, you're going to have a line of these squared off spots going down the middle of the back. But if you can't quite tell if this one's a little rounded, you might go, well, that looks a little rounded to me. But if you look right here in the growing, see that bright yellow color? You see that bright yellow color with that combination. you know for sure you have a northern pickerel frog. And then, of course, if you can't decide, it doesn't show you the yellow, you can't get close enough, just wait and listen, and it'll tell you. Sounds like an old man snoring. I'm an old man, I can say that. It's sort of, you know, and you're catching that second breath, make sure you get it all. A lot of other frogs in the background, but that one, did you hear the one that was that sort of real low snoring type sound, if you would? That real low snoring type sound lets you know that you have the northern pickerel frog. This is one of the species that we typically refer to as the tree frogs. When you're grouping frogs, what scientists do is they have tree frogs, and then they have true frogs, and then they have true toads, and then they have toad-like. The terms frog and toad are not scientific words. As I mentioned earlier, they're both anurans. That's the scientific term for them. We will look at some differences between frogs and toads. I'll do toads toward the very end of this. But these are the ones they refer to as the tree frogs. Hyla is the genus. This is our green tree frog, which you'll hear down in the Landrum area. I don't hear these on top of the mountain where I live. Okay. They're the tree frog of the higher mountains that we hear in the Carolinas is going to be the Copse gray tree frog. This is the one we kind of see down in the Piedmont a lot. It'll go down toward the sand hills. You'll see it in the coastal plain. They like to stick on the screen windows. You ever seen them do that? They've got these great little sticky toes, and these wonderful little sticky toes, if you would, will allow them to be able to climb up the trees. Also, you'll notice on this one you've got sort of a line starting at the chin, running back through there. There is another species of green tree frog that occurs only in the Northeast. It's a different species. We don't see those here, but if you get to an area where they do overlap, then that's one of the things you look for is that line. And they pretty much sound about the same. Okay? Now this is the one that we hear most often, even on the inner Piedmont, so Highway 11 kind of over, and then certainly higher up in the mountains area. And this is the Copse, C-O-P-E-S, Copse gray tree frog. Once again, a pretty good name. It's kind of a grayish green, if you would. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times with frogs, you don't see them because they're like masters of camouflage. And being up in these trees, you will find them many times where you have different lichens that are growing on the trees. Sometimes those lichens are just green or silvery green blotches, if you would, actually part of the tree itself. Sometimes they're kind of peeling away like this, a little bit more leafy-like in nature. And sometimes they're very fancy lichens, if you would, that almost look like Spanish moss hanging down our usneas. So if you look on here, what you've got is you've got some things that look almost patch-like. You've got some things, even though that they're still attached to the body, seem to be raised up a little bit more. But that looking like lichen, if you would, is good camouflage to help keep this animal from being eaten by its predators. Okay? Now you're going to recognize there are going to be several calls in here. I'm going to point this one out to you, but there's some other things in here as well. This is your quiz. How many different frogs do you hear, okay? That higher you're hearing peepers in the background, coarse frogs in the background. Sort of that one note that you're hearing that's a little bit different from the rest is the gray tree frog, the Copse gray tree frog. All right, so I gave you a hint. How many frogs? Peepers, gray tree frog, coarse frog. Okay.
Was there a bullfrog?
There was a bullfrog. Good. I didn't point that one out, but yes, there was a bullfrog back in there as well. All right. Now, this puzzle of what's a frog and what's a toad, and are there toadstools? I would say if there is a toadstool, this would be a perfect stool for a toad. Seems to be getting a little shade up underneath there. But when you're discussing or talking about the difference between frogs and toads, when we mention a frog, what do you usually tell people? The frog is. How do you know the difference between a frog and a toad?
Wet versus dry.
Oh, wet versus dry. Usually the frog has moist skin. They are amphibians, so all have moist skin, but they feel more moist.
Wartiness?
Warty. Which one's usually more warty? Toads usually have more warts on you, right? And by the way, if a frog urinates on you, you will get warts, right? No, not really. That's one of those old wives' tale. Just as much as if you get warts, frog urine will help remove them. No, don't work that way. Okay.
Toads brown?
Some toads are brown, some are red. Particularly when you get into the Fowler's toad, sometimes they can be a real deep red, and we're going to look at some toads in just a moment. But they're usually more of a color of soil or leaves, whereas most of our frogs are usually going to have some green in them, not always. Okay? So maybe a little bit of difference in color, skin texture, bumpiness, no bumpiness.
Webbed feet.
Webbed feet. Okay. Remember the egg mass that I showed you on the wood frog? Look like little grapes, right? These are toad eggs. Toads lay their eggs in long strings. Each one of these is an individual egg, but it looks almost like a black pearl necklace, if you would. Okay. So if you're not sure and you go out and you look in your pond and you see these long strings of eggs, you know that a toad laid those. If you see them in clusters or you have groupings of them, it's a frog or it's a salamander. Okay. So it gets a little trickier at that point. Okay. Either way, both frogs and toads, when the eggs hatch out, you get what we call a tadpole or a pollywog. Both can be used interchangeably. Okay? And this is the toad that most of us are probably the most familiar with. Now you can tell by the crest running down the middle of the back, the cranial lobes, the number of bumps per square. We'll look at that in a minute. But you'll know it by its call. This makes me think summer. Yeah. This is the American toad. Okay. American toads typically have, we look on the back of the frog, or the toad, if you would, you can kind of make out this one particularly. It's got a black ring around it. These are little spots, or little patches, if you would, little spots. And then they have these little bumps inside of them. If you get a good enough look at it, and there are 3 or fewer bumps per spot, it is an American toad. If you get 4 or more, it's not. Okay. All right. So you can impress your friends when you go out and it's out there. If it doesn't call you, just get a good look at it. By the way, these frogs up in our mountains are where they reach their greatest size. Across from this side to this side, Yeah, there's one that lives outside the residence that I live in, and there's a little light there. What do you think the light attracts? Yeah, insects. What do you think the insects are attracting? Yeah. So I used to think maybe it was just Jabba the Hutt. But it turns out, as I learned more in life, several years ago I learned that no, it's not just because it has a really good diet hanging out by your light. It's that the mountain populations are larger than the ones that we get at the base. And there's some interesting theories as to why that is. It has to do with maybe temperature regulation. Of course, toads and frogs are both amphibians, so they're both what we call cold-blooded. Have to think about it for a minute. They're exothermic, which means exo means outside, right? Exit. So exothermic means that your body temperature is regulated from the outside. Endothermic means it's regulated from the inside. We call that warm-blooded. Okay? So they think it may have something to do with these cold-blooded animals regulating the loss of heat, but also maybe by increasing their heat by body size as well. But they get big, all right? Now this guy doesn't look too happy. This is the Fowler's toad. And Fowler's toads, if you look in one of the patches, you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bumps. 1, 2, 3, 4 bumps. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, yes, sometimes you will get one. So you have to look at lots of patches. Don't just look at one patch and try to determine the number. You want to look at all of them, or most of them, to kind of get an idea if you're going to have more than 3 per patch. And if you do, you have what is known as the Fowler's toad. Fowler's toad, you will see in the description many times, will tell you it has this lateral line running the length of the body. Sometimes so does the American toad. Just to make it fun. Okay? So you got to count those bumps per spot, if you would. All right? All right. Now, I mentioned they and we, and yes?
Are you saying Fowler, like F-O-W-L-E-R?
Mm-hmm, Fowler. And it's Fowlers as in ownership.
Did he name it, or how did it get that name?
I have heard a couple of stories. The scientific name is Fowleri, which means it was named in honor of Fowler. Usually it's kind of frowned upon if you name something after yourself. Even if you're the first to describe it, so it's usually named in honor of someone. But that is a great question. I don't know who Fowler was.
I just asked because that's half of my ancestry.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. Yeah. So I always consider a talk or a program a successful talk if I go home with homework. Because it reminds me that, yeah, I definitely don't know everything, but also it also tells me that my audience is engaged and they're thinking, I wonder why it's done that. So, but I'll find the answer to that out. Why is it called Fowler's toad, and whom was Fowler? Okay. Good question, though. But when I mentioned that scientists lumping or separating out different species, trying to decide what frequency is based if it's a single call or if it's a chorus, identifying species. There's a huge program out there now called Frog Watch. It's Frog Watch USA. You've heard of Frog Watch. Okay. Frog Watch is managed through AZA, which is the American Zoos and Aquariums. And Frog Watch, you get trained as a volunteer. Anybody can do it. You just go to a training. You get trained as a volunteer, and what you do is you go out 30 minutes after official sunset, and for a 5-minute period, you listen and identify all the frog calls that you hear and the frequency. So needless to say, you practice a little bit, and when you first start doing this, you go out with folks who say, oh, there's a coarse frog, there's a peeper. You hear that snoring over there? That's that pickerel. So you begin to learn those. And the chapter which I am involved with is out of the Greenville Zoo. It's frogs. Frog Watch researchers of the Greenville Zoo. I thought that was pretty clever. Frogs. Barbara Foster is the person in charge there, and Barbara does these trainings, but she also helps out with volunteers and also helps at locations where to do some of the Frog Watch counts. And she is so excited. I took the Frog Watch class a year ago, and I sat there very quietly, and I never really said anything. Class was over, I left. About 3 months ago, a volunteer that works with me said, "We need to do Frog Watch." And I said, "Okay. Can you count the frogs?" I don't know when I'm going to be able to do that. I can help you some, but there's no way I can commit to that. So we got in touch with Barbara, and she met with us, and she said, "I had no idea you had wood frogs. Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I was afraid if I spoke up that this would happen. You would be like, do this, do this." But I'm very glad that we have a Frog Watch site. We have the first Frog Watch site in South Carolina that has wood frogs, and so Barbara just loves it to death. Not because we have the only population of wood frogs. They're spread throughout. But because it's the first site to which she actually has wood frogs. And they had to go back in and change the whole criteria. They had to get in touch with Frog Watch and get the... You wouldn't start until March. Well, wood frogs are done. So they had to go in and shift the calendar a little bit and say we could start counting earlier for the wood frogs.
When you say they're done with their sounds?
Yeah, because they're done mating.
Okay.
About the only time you're going to know there are wood frogs around is late December, early January, up to maybe the first 2 weeks of February, unless you're at higher elevations, because you're going to hear them calling. You're going to know they're there because you're going to find the masses of eggs. And then after that, you're not going to know they're around. It's if on the first warm rain in that evening, it's like they just come out of the ground. Now, they're not really coming out of the ground, but they're buried up underneath the leaf material, and as they start to come out, these are frogs that don't come out very much. They're quiet most of the year because if you make a lot of sound, guess what? Your predators know you're there. Snakes, birds, all those things are going to eat you. You only want to be noticed when you want to be noticed. And that's during mating season. Okay. So you don't see them very often. Okay. So why are scientists doing this? Why is it so important to have all these individuals to go out and to listen to frogs all over North America?
They're endangered.
They're in decline. Okay? They are in decline. As I mentioned earlier, they're very sensitive to changes within their environment. So changes within water quality can affect them. Changes within air quality can affect them. Changes in climate can affect them. If there are toxins that come into an area by the air or by the water or any other mechanism, they're very sensitive to that. So they are in decline. Turns out birds and amphibians, of all the animals that we have on the planet, are those that are the most greatly threatened by changes within the environment in which they live in. Insects are tough. Okay. That's why there's more of them than anything else. All right? So we can not only learn where they are, so it's called distribution. Where is it that we have wood frogs? Where do we have coarse frogs? Where are the pickerel frogs at? Why is it that we know we don't have versicolor, which, by the way, versicolor is the species of green tree frog from the Northeast? It's because you go out and you listen. It's very much like with birding. We know a lot about birds because there's a lot of people who volunteer by birding, Christmas bird counts, spring migration, feeder watches. All those things make a huge, huge citizen science volunteer corps. And that's what Frog Watch is all about. Okay? To try to get an idea of where the distribution is, but also what the numbers are. There's also at least one, they're thinking two, maybe three now, but definitely one fungus that has been introduced to the area called chytrid. And chytrid affects not only frogs and toads, but also salamanders and newts and other amphibians as well, which is starting to impact their numbers. Yes, sir.
What about the impact of acid rain? I know recently we've had scrubbers put on power plants to reduce that. I'm just wondering if that has had any studies that show the impact of acid rain.
There are some studies that have been done on looking at the effects of acid rain. Rain within itself is acidic in nature, but once you get to a certain point is when it gets classified as acidic rain. What that does is it can change not just directly the impact on the animal, the organism itself, but it can affect aquatic ecosystems. So in other words, it can have an impact on aquatic insects, can have an impact on aquatic fishes. So the food source can be declined, so therefore they have less food availability. They also are sensitive to certain ranges of pH, so that could limit where they're going to be located as well. Good question, though. And I'll talk more about that afterwards if you want. Okay. All right, let me go ahead and finish up, and then we'll take some questions. But we'll get yours now.
I just want to say that they were using frogs so much in the classroom laboratories, they just about exterminated them.
There were large numbers of frogs used to teach kids about science. Today, most of that is done with computer systems, and you dissect a frog on a computer. Absolutely, yes. Right? So that information is being utilized to help scientists to be able to gain a better understanding about how that is the natural world, how it's changing, and how that might be impacting frogs in general. But also the frogs themselves are also telling us, that canary in the coal mine, if you would, about what's happening, which ties in nicely with what Conserving Carolina does in terms of helping to protect areas for habitat, for different organisms that are out there. So what questions can I answer for you?
I have two.
Okay.
First one is, this is really helpful, just like birding, you're listening. Obviously birds, you see them more. But is there a resource where I can see that and then hear it so that when I want your presentation.
She filmed it.
Okay.
She filmed it.
Is it going to be on the site? Because I think that's really helpful. Like you say, I'll see a toad at the front door. I see that, right? That's now fun. But I didn't realize that was the call. And I sit on the porch and I listen to that call and I didn't know it was a toad.
Yes.
Cool.
And there are several resources that are out there. Of course, in today's time, there's wonderful things available out there on the internet, but I also tell you there's some things out there that aren't.
Right.
If you went on there and said, you saw this and you said it looks green, it's a green frog, and you put green frog, you would be amazed at all the things you get if you put green frog, because just look for everything with green frog in it.
Right.
And it may show you a frog that is not a green frog. I always recommend going to primary sources. So primary sources would be things like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, universities. North Carolina has a great herpetology site. It's out of Davidson College, and I think it's the Herps of the Carolinas maybe, but it's out of Davidson College. It's a great place to go and look. But yeah, be careful with that when you go on the internet, because sometimes we'll have the absolute wrong thing. Okay. You'll have a frog or a toad, and the call they have with it is not the correct one. Sometimes it might simply be that they have versicolor, the northern species of green frog, tree frog, versus the southern one, and it won't sound the same.
And here's another stumping question for me. So we have a 75-foot water feature with a pond below. We have 3 ponds in it. I have frogs in those, both bullfrogs and one other. I'm not sure yet, but based on that. How do they get there?
We were having this conversation earlier, weren't we? If you build it, they will come. Yes. It's if all of a sudden there's this oasis where there was once not water, and they find that water.
They'll find it even like if the stream is a quarter mile away.
They'll move. They'll move to find the water, particularly when it's when the conditions are right. They're not going to come out on a hot sunny day Frogs usually move around at nighttime. That's usually why they sing at night. It's when they're usually going to be feeding more. So that's why we don't usually see them very often, because they're usually out at night when they don't have the sunlight on them. And
Do they communicate with each other, say, hey, go that way?
They do. They communicate through sound, but they also communicate through pheromones as well, so through the nose.
Okay.
Yeah, I built a garden pond in my parents' backyard a long time ago. And there were no frogs. I'd never seen a frog or a toad anywhere. And there's no water anywhere near it until you get to the creek, which was a mile away. My dad came in, he said, all right, where'd you get the toad? I said, what do you mean? He said, you put a toad in the pond. I'm like, no, I didn't put a toad in the pond. It found it. It found it. And they actually, another one found the other frog. And there were lots of frogs then.
I don't mean to dominate the thing, but it's interesting if you've got one. We have to be very careful what time of year we actually empty it and clean it, because there was one year there was all these tadpoles and I really needed to clean the leaves out, but I didn't want to do it, so I went a full year because I couldn't get rid of the tadpoles.
Save the tadpoles. And that's one of those things, if you happen to have a garden pond or whatnot, they'll come in if you got filters and stuff. You know, those filters can do a little bit of damage to them. So give them a little time, they'll get to the point where they'll be okay, and then they'll leave and you can start your pump back up again. Yes, sir. You had your hand up first, I think.
The interesting things I noticed one time, I have a small little garden pool, and it was right at dusk, and I saw a frog, I think it was a bullfrog, could have been a green frog, jump out of the pond and go into the flower garden to feed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
I thought toads don't like water.
Oh, yes.
I mean, a toad will go into a pond too also?
Sure.
Oh, okay. I mean, I know you said they laid their eggs. I just thought they,
Yeah, they'll go into the, you don't,
like a turtle likes water, a tortoise doesn't. I thought toads don't like
Right.
water as a frog does.
well, it's like the wood frog or it's the tree frogs. They're not going to be in the water their entire life, which makes them an amphibian, both lives, part on land, part in water. So they will go there to lay their eggs. Once they hatch out, they come out of the water and have these little tiny frogs and toads jumping around everywhere. And then they'll go back to water. A lot of times they will be near the water's edge because a lot of insects, turns out greater than 90% of all insects spend part of their life in water. So it's a good food source for them. So they'll go down by the water to feed. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
I don't remember you showing us a chorus frog.
I didn't.
Because you just didn't.
Because they said I could have 45 minutes. Not just kidding. Yes, sir.
So how many species would we find, say, around Landrum of
Oh, that's a great question. A dozen or more. I won't say an exact number, but I think at least a dozen or more. Yeah, you're going to have Fowler toad, American toad. You're going to have green tree frog, Copse gray tree frog. You're going to have chorus. You're going to have pickerel. You're going to have spring peeper. You're going to have bullfrog. You're going to have green frog. Oh, there's one called a spadefoot toad. Really cool. I caught one at Fence, so I know there's one over there. So that's 10 right off the top of my head. I'm sure I forgot some, but a dozen or more.
But what's the littlest, smallest one? Like the one you showed that was on their finger?
That was a spring peeper. That's a spring peeper. We actually have the spadefoot's actually not much bigger. That's a pretty small one as well.
What's the name?
Spadefoot toad? Spadefoot toad is a common name for it. That's the other thing. I keep saying common and scientific. Many people will disagree with me, and that's okay. I don't mind. There is no incorrect common name. A rose by any other name is still a rose, right? Now, there are incorrect scientific names. So a lot of times they get very different names, but usually it's pretty close. Yes, sir.
I want to follow up on a question earlier. They were asking about a source for the frogs, sort of like the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and they got the birds, they up you the pictures, and the calls and the songs and so forth. Is there a similar source for frogs?
I have not found one as complete as like Cornell with birds. You will find multiple sites that are going to have some of them.
Okay.
They actually, I guess you could still get them, but there's a CD you can buy with all the frog calls on it. But I am not aware of one that is going to be complete, but that doesn't mean there's not one. Yeah, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is a good place to go. The North Carolina one out of Davidson College is a really good one. There's one called the Wandering Herpetologist, I believe. I believe it is. I think it's the Wandering Herpetologist. It's a good site. Yeah, not only on herps, but not only frogs, toads, but also salamanders and other things. Alan Cameron has some things on there, green salamanders and things like that. So, all right, I have time for one more question, and then after that, I'll wrap things up, but you're welcome to stay afterwards. I'll be answering questions, but one more before we wrap it up.
I brought some pictures.
I like pictures.
Are leopard frogs more northern?
Yes. Leopard frogs are more northern.
As we're raising children, we usually say frog or toad says croak or ribbit. Now, what would those be close to, kind of croak and a ribbit?
A croak and a ribbit.
Ribbit? You know.
Ribbit. Well, it's like with birds. We try to put English words with them to kind of help us out a little bit. We do the same thing with frogs. The bullfrog, for example, you may hear them say, "Come around." So come around. Or some people say, "Jug-a-rum." Depends on your audience. Okay. And then there's other things you can put into them, like the peepers peep. But ribbit and croak, that's a good one. There must be some origin of the ribbit and the croak.
It's a real low sound.
I don't know. The croak usually is associated with frog because there's a croaker sack. Okay, all right, good. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap the presentation up with saying thank you to each of you. You've given me a gift that I cannot return to you. You've given me your time, and for that, I thank you.